Welcome to Part 2 of a two-part VOD which will walk you through the installation of Unified CCMP 852. In Part 1, we covered the installation of the prerequisite software. In Part 2, we will cover the installation of the core CCMP components themselves, as well as configuration and validation testing. The first component we will install is the CCMP database installer on the Side A database server. Before installing the database component, we must first run a check to ensure that the prerequisites are in place. If the prerequisite check succeeds, we can proceed with the installation. The installer will ask for a cryptography passphrase. Make sure that you record this passphrase for future use. You'll need it when reinstalling or upgrading CCMP. When the database installer installation completes, the database install tool itself will launch. First, you must provide credentials for connecting to SQL Server. These credentials will be used to create the CCMP database during the installation, so they must have write access to the database server. Test the connection to check the credentials work. It's normal at this point to see a message stating that the database does not exist. We are installing a new database, so we can accept the default option and proceed. Although we're installing a dual-sided system, we don't need to check the replicated checkbox here, as we will be setting up the replication folder share on the B side later. At this point, we can set the initial file sizes for the database files, and also the rules for managing their growth. Next, we must supply the credentials under which the SQL Server Agent service will run. As this is a dual-sided installation, this must be a domain user. We must also supply the details of the network service account for each of the web servers in our deployment. This information is used to grant access to the portal database for those servers. We're now ready to install the database. When the database installation is complete, we need to give the reporting services execution account permissions on the CCMP database. We do this using SQL Server Management Studio. Add a new login for the execution account user and make sure that they have the portal, portal reporting, and portal RS roles. Next, we're going to install the Side A web server components. First, we'll install the application server component. Again, we'll be asked for a cryptography password. Use the same password you used previously when installing the database. Next, we need to tell the application server which server is hosting the CCMP database. Take care not to accept the default value, which is the local machine, as this is a dual-tier installation and our database is located on a separate server. Once again, we must run the prerequisite checks. Once the application server installation is complete, we can move on to install the web server component. Once again, we must run the prerequisite checks. There's no user input required during the web server installation. Now we can move back to the Side A database server to install the data import server and provisioning server components. First, we're going to install the data import server component. After running the prerequisite check, we can begin the installation. We must re-enter the cryptography passphrase and provide the details for connecting to the CCMP database. We've chosen Windows authentication for the data import server to connect to the CCMP database. This means that the network service account will be used. If necessary, we can change the location in which the data import server stores its temporary files. That's all the information the data import server installer needs, so we can begin the installation. Once the data import server install is complete, we can install the provisioning server component. As usual, run the prerequisite check and then begin the installation. As we did for the data import server component, we provide the cryptography passphrase and the means to connect to the CCMP database. Each of the core CCMP components is now installed on the Side A servers. We now follow the same steps to install them on the B side. When installing the B-side components, there are a few minor differences. The key difference when installing the database on Side B is that we will configure the replication folder share. When installing the application server on Side B, enter the machine name for the B-side database server. One of the things we're going to do here post-install is to set the recovery model for the CCMP database to simple. This is optional, but doing this means that we'll need less storage space for backups, and the process of restoring from backup is simpler. It also reduces the administrative overhead of transaction log management. The downside is that we can only restore to the point of the last full backup. Now all the CCMP components are installed on both sides. Next, we need to configure the UCCE admin workstation to allow CCMP to connect through ConAPI. First, we must set up an application instance using the Application Instance List tool. Make a note of the application key, as you will need it later. We also need to configure the CMS server to enable the CCMP provisioning server to connect to UCCE. Using the CMS control console, we add a new application connection for CCMP. For the administration and data server link name, use the machine name of the CCMP database server with the word server appended. For the RMI registry port, specify a port on the CCMP database server on which UCCE can connect back to CCMP. If you are connecting CCMP to multiple instances of UCCE, you must use a different port for each instance of UCCE. For the application link name, use the machine name of the CCMP database server with the word client appended. For the application host name, use the machine name of the CCMP database server. As we are setting up a dual-sided system, we'll need two application connections. Just as we needed to open a firewall port for SQL Server, we'll need to do the same for ConAPI. We'll create a rule for the TCP protocol for the RMI registry port we specified when we configured CMS, and also for the default local port used by UCCE to connect to CCMP. By default, this is 3333 for the A side and 3334 for the B side. Now that we've configured ConAPI and CMS server, we can perform CCMP cluster configuration. Cluster configuration is the process of providing CCMP with the details of all the servers that it needs to know about, including the CCMP servers themselves and the UCCE and CUCM servers which CCMP will connect to. We only need to do this on the side A database server, as the information will be replicated to the B side. Launch the CCMP Configuration Manager tool and connect to the local database. First, we need to input the details of all the servers in our cluster. We're adding the details of each database server and each web server in our CCMP deployment, as well as the UCCE admin workstation. Next, we add details about the CCMP servers. Specify which servers are the primary and secondary application servers. Click New to add a new CCMP database. Do this for the Side A and Side B database servers. Now that we've added the CCMP databases into the cluster, we can configure replication. Before we do that, we'll just check that the SQL Server Agent service is running and that it's running under the correct user, which is the domain user we specified when we installed the database. If the SQL Server Agent service is not running, start it now. Click the Replication button to begin replication setup. For a standard deployment, the distributor is located on the B side. Click Replicate to finalize replication setup. Next, we'll set up the publisher on the Side B database server. Use the Replication Monitor tool to add the publisher. Make sure you add the publisher for the Side A database server. If we expand the publisher, we can see two snapshots. Click on the base snapshot and go to the Warnings and Agents tab to start the snapshot agent. When the status changes to completed, start the non-queued snapshot. When the non-queued snapshot completes, we can close the replication monitor and return to the Side A database server to continue with cluster configuration. The next task is to set up reporting services replication. Add the reporting services databases and click Replication. As we've already set up CCMP database replication, the replication settings for reporting services are pre-populated. Before we set up reporting services replication, we should take a backup of the report server encryption key from the Side A web server. This is done using the Reporting Services Configuration Manager tool. We'll restore this key on the Side B report server after replicating the database. We can now replicate the Reporting Services database. When replication setup is complete, use the Reporting Services Configuration Manager tool on the Side B web server to restore the encryption key backup from the Side A web server. The last piece of cluster configuration information we need to provide about the CCMP deployment is the identity of the servers hosting the provisioning service. This will always be the Side A and Side B database servers. Now we can add information about UCCE servers that CCMP will be connecting to. Click New to add a new UCCE instance and choose the server from the drop-down list. In most cases, you'll use SQL Server authentication to connect to the admin workstation. Choose the ICM instance from the drop-down and enter the CON API credentials that were configured earlier. You can optionally provide Active Directory details which will be used to look up usernames when associating a supervisor user with an Active Directory user in CCMP. CCMP can also connect to Communications Manager for provisioning resources such as IP endpoints and directory numbers. Add the Communications Manager server, if you haven't already done so, and specify the Communications Manager details under the Unified CM tab. Before we can add a Communications Manager, we must import the tenants and peripherals from UCCE. Make sure you specify the correct Communications Manager version and provide details for the Communications Manager user that will be used to connect. You can use the Test button to test the connection. In the Associated Tenants section, add each UCCE tenant that will be associated with the Communications Manager. Specify the associated peripherals and PG users under Associated Peripherals. This is the user with which new phones will be associated when they're created using CCMP. In this example, we've used the same user for all PGs. We've now completed cluster configuration for our CCMP deployment. We can save our changes and exit the Configuration Manager tool. We're just about ready to upload the CCMP audit reports and log in for the first time. Before we do that, we're going to check that the CCMP services on each server are up and running. First, we'll check the services on the web servers. These will most likely be running already. For the database servers, you may find you need to start the CCMP services. We're now ready to log in for the first time. Upon first login, the administrator user password will be blank. You'll be prompted to enter a new password. We can use the System Manager tool to check that our tenant and UCCE resources are being imported. Depending on the size of your system, it may take some time before all the resources are imported. If you plan to use the CCMP audit reports, then you'll need to upload them. Use the Report Uploader tool on the Side A web server to do this. Use the administrator user and password that you've just set up as the credentials for uploading the reports. Basic CCMP setup is now complete. Please review the user and administration guides for additional information on configuring your system. It's a good idea to validate that your setup has been successful. There are some basic checks we can perform to do this. Test that CCMP can provision to UCCE by creating a new skill group in System Manager. When the status of the skill group moves to Ready, we know that we've succeeded. If we log on to the Side B web server after a short while, we should see the same skill group. We can repeat the test on the B-side web server, again checking back on the A-side to confirm that our change is visible on both sides. We've now confirmed that we can provision to UCCE from each side and that replication is working in both directions for CCMP data. We can create a new IP phone to test Communications Manager provisioning. Finally, we're going to check that the audit reports are working. Before we can run the report, we need to create a new parameter set for our tenant. check that the report can be run on both sides. You can test that reporting services replication is working by creating a linked report on the Side A server and checking that it is visible and can be executed from the Side B server, and vice versa. We have now installed and configured CCMP and validated that our installation has been a success. For more information on CCMP, please consult the online help and the documentation available on cisco.com.